Welcome to Scriptural Works, a podcast that engages Scripture in new and innovative ways to produce meaning for today's postmodern world. Co-host Greg Camp, Professor Emeritus, Pastor and Biblical Scholar, and Patrick Spencer, Biblical Scholar and Silicon Valley Tech Executive, employ various interpretive approaches to generate new meaning from ancient text, revealing timeless wisdom relevant for ministers, lay leaders, and interested readers of the Bible. Get more podcast articles and other useful resources at scripturalworks.com. Welcome to the inaugural Scriptural Works podcast, where my co-host and co-editor Greg Camp and I examine ancient text using a variety of different interpretive approaches to elicit new and thought-provoking meaning for a postmodern world. Hey, Greg. Welcome to our first show.
Thanks, Pat. It's great to do this together.
This is exciting. I'm looking forward to doing many of these episodes. The more we do them, I think the more addicted we will become to diving into the various topics that we pinpointed.
There's so much more to learn from each other.
Absolutely. So my first question for you is, why, Greg, are we doing this? Why are we doing this podcast?
Well, there are a lot of really great podcasts on the Bible, but most of them lack episodic coherence. They have ad hoc show topics, and we hope to build a series of shows on topics. For example, since this is year C in the liturgical calendar, we're planning to spend some time in Luke Acts for people who are preaching through the lectionary.
On some of our shows, you have some shows where it's just the host talking, and they do a lot of talking. We might do a little bit of talking here and there, as you alluded, but we also, with our show, second of all, we're hoping to feature you and me on some topics, but we'll bring in some guest experts on other topics that we may not have as much knowledge about, or they may have a brand new book or a new article they've recently published where you think it'll bring insights to our audience. Well, that's two. What's number three?
Yep. Well, pastors and lay leaders lead very busy lives, and we want to make it easy for them to tap information and insights that will enable their growth and give them tools to be more effective in their ministries, and perhaps to point them in direction of research that they might be interested in.
Yeah, and I think that's really important because there's a lot of stuff out there. Some of it's good, some of it's not so good. And we're all very, very busy. It's hard to find resources that you can tap into that provide you with the content that helps you mature professionally, helps you become more spiritual, helps you focus on delivering what your congregations need. And that's what we're hoping to accomplish with our show. And the last thing that I think is a little bit unique about what we're doing here, when we were brainstorming about how we wanted to structure Scriptural Works, is the fact that it's just not a podcast. We're going to have a lot of valuable resources on the website, scripturalworks.com, starting with the fact that we have these articles that we're publishing in concert with the different shows that we produce. So, for example, for today's show, which dives into New Testament textual criticism, we'll talk about that in a moment. There's an actual article already up on the site on this very topic that has resources at the very end. It has, I think, 60 some different footnotes that link to different sources. And it's a lengthy read. It's about a 30 or 40-minute read that our listeners can dive into for more details. So if we talk and touch on a particular subject and they want to know more, they likely can go to that article and get more information.
Right. So we're going to use different formats and reach out to people with whatever suits them best. If they just want to listen in, they can do so. But if they want to go into a little more depth in their research, that'll be there as well for them. So we look forward to helping give people what they need.
And that's a great point in terms of listening. You can watch it. It's available on YouTube. That's why we're doing it in video. That's sort of now the way to do podcasts nowadays, is everyone does them in video as well as audio. But you can find them on your traditional channels. We're on Apple. We're going to be on Spotify. We're on iHeartRadio and so forth. But you can also get the actual video version on YouTube if you want to see the two of us interact and go back and forth with each other. And then we're on some social channels. So every time we publish a new podcast, an article, and some of the other resources that we've been brainstorming about on the site, you'll be able to see those posts show up on Facebook. They'll show up on LinkedIn. They'll show up on X and Twitter, and perhaps some other social channels TikTok, we may have little excerpts from the show that show up on that channel that may whet everyone's appetite. So if they see Greg pontificating on a particular subject for 45 seconds, they'll say, well, I want to know more. I'm going to watch the entire show on that particular subject. So
Yeah, that probably won't happen, but the pontificating part will happen. That's without a doubt. So,
well, how did we pick this first topic, Greg? We worked on an editorial calendar, and we don't have it published on the website yet, like you alluded to. Rather than just a bunch of ad hoc shows that are not necessarily connected, which are still valuable podcasts in and of themselves, but we're trying to like group them. So like year C is Luke, so we're going to have a series of shows on Luke and probably some on Acts, since they sort of go hand in hand. But there'll be some other topics, like in this case, we picked out New Testament textual criticism, but I have a suspicion that's not the only show we're going to produce on that. So our listeners are going to be able to, if they go to the site, there's a couple of articles up already, if you want to see what the roadmap looks like, but there'll be other topics we touch on as well.
exactly. So why did we pick textual criticism to get started with?
Yeah.
That's, one of the things that I think most of the people in church, and I pastor part-time as well, is there's just an assumption that the Bible they have in their hand is what God sent down through Moses or Peter and Paul or whoever. But it's a little bit more difficult than that. So what's our problem that leads us to the need for textual criticism?
Well, it depends on what Bible translation you have in your hand as well, right? Some may have a different reading than another Bible. And we'll talk about a few of those controversial readings. We actually have a few shows dedicated to some of those topics that are coming up in the future. But it depends on, if you have the King James Version, you're going to have something we're going to talk about later in the show, the Textus Receptus. So you're going to have the long ending of Mark, for example. You'll have Luke 22, 43 and 43 and 44. I'll get the verses right yet. You'll have the Johannine Trinitarian formula in First John in there and so forth. So it sort of depends on what translation, and textual criticism helps inform decisions as to, what actual translation you have of the Bible, but why the translation is as it is, and also helps you decide what translations you may want to pick. All of them have pluses and minuses, and we're going to dive into the manuscript tradition and the readings that are found therein, and talk a bit about how the Bible came about, because the printing press, needless to say, did not exist in the first century. Paul didn't start rolling out all those letters of his and distributing them all over the place. It was a much more tedious and laborious process. Probably do a show on that as well. That's a good topic.
Couldn't go down to the local printing shop and just have a bunch of them pulled out, hand them your credit card, and away we go.
Yeah. So as we dive into this concept of New Testament textual criticism, we'll do a separate show on Old Testament textual criticism, because it's quite fascinating as well. R.P.C. Hansen, there's this quote of his that we both called when we were doing some research on this subject before the show. He said, "I look upon the textual critic as I look upon the man who comes to clean the drains." For those of us who have gutters on our house, we know all painfully too well what that's like. I should not like to do it myself, but I'm very glad that someone likes to do it. And I think that is quite apropos. Because if you're a New Testament academic, or you're even a minister or a lay teacher, it's something that you probably don't relish unless you're a textual critic. And I've known some very passionate textual critics, needless to say, during my lifetime, but we rely on the many, many hours they put into learning the ancient text and analyzing and comparing the different textual traditions. So Greg, when we look at the various texts that are out there, how many do we have? Obviously, when we're talking about the New Testament, everything was originally written in Greek. So how many New Testament manuscripts do we have? And, we have, church fathers, we have translations into other languages. So we have piles and piles of stuff that we can call through when it comes to trying to figure out what that quote unquote original or early text of the New Testament looked like.
Right. We have some complicated issues here. One is that when we approach the Bible at church, we have something that's printed in front of us, and it's, all the books that we're used to. And we may recognize that there was a translation issue, but But we don't always recognize that there are actually a lot of different manuscripts that lie behind that. Sometimes these are just bits and pieces of a passage, and sometimes they're an entire work. So there are 5,800 Greek New Testament manuscripts, meaning different pieces of ancient Greek texts. We sometimes switch between the use of the word manuscript and text, but manuscript is the physical thing that you would hold. Almost like somebody went through and tore up a Bible and you had to piece it all back together, and you get all these different manuscripts floating around, and you're trying to figure out where it belongs and what time period it's from. But we have a lot of these Greek New Testament manuscripts, 5,800, as I said. Compare that to the next best attested ancient text, which is Homer's Iliad, which only has about 650. So there's almost 10 times as many manuscripts or pieces of manuscripts for the New Testament than for Homer's Iliad, which students have to read all the time. How can we be sure of what that text is? Well, some of the earliest fragments, again, little tiny pieces of these manuscripts, date for the New Testament all the way back to the 2nd century. So to be clear about centuries, that means the 100s. And that's in a papyrus that testifies to the Gospel of John. So P52, as we call it, has a little piece of John on it. In classical works, there's usually at least a 500-year gap before or between the time that the author supposedly was living and writing to the time that we have a manuscript. 500 years. That's a long time. Whereas for the New Testament, it's about a century before we start getting, or less, before we start getting some of these fragments.
Well, you're
And so,
talking about Gospel of John. Gospel of John, depending on who you're talking to, right? They date it maybe the late 1st century, so in the 90s up into
right,
the early part of the 2nd century. So when you're looking at P52, it's a very, very, very early manuscript, and we have others that are similar to it. We talked about the papyrus. Papyrus are the ones that are the earliest manuscripts that we have. They date between the 2nd century and the 4th century, somewhere in that time frame. And then we have these parchment codices, which are more like books and parchments, if you may. They're not papyri made out of papyrus, that date during the 4th to the 16th century. So when you referred to those mounds of 5,800 Greek manuscripts, and when you look at the church fathers, as well as all the different languages that Coptic and Ethiopic and Georgian and Latin, and then you just go down the long list, right? You have over 10,000 different manuscripts.
right.
So you have the ones in the various languages and the church fathers, and then you have the actual Greek manuscripts that date anywhere from the very early 2nd century, maybe even the very late 1st century in a few instances, all the way up until about the time of the printing press. And then there's no reason to have these scriptoriums where they were copying and writing out these Greek manuscripts of the Bible that were consumed and read in church. Usually wealthy people, somewhere in our notes here, were the ones who had copies of the scriptures or the Bible in their homes, because it was expensive to do all this copying. And then what's interesting is you could actually tell based on the size of the manuscript as to whether it was a part of a private collection or it was actually part of the the quote unquote public collection that was read in church. Early copies were made most likely based on all the experts who are out there by professional as well as non-professional scribes, and you had these scriptoriums that started up early on, particularly once the 4th century, 5th century rolled around, where they were actually copying them and in groups within monasteries and so forth. The later medieval manuscripts certainly were produced in the monastic scriptoria with formalized procedures in terms of how everything was written down. And when you look at all of these, particularly with all the computer, I think, Greg, you're going to talk a bit about this a little later on in today's show. There's over 400,000 textual variants across all manuscripts when you talk about the New Testament. So you have a huge pile of data, if you may, if you're looking at it from a data analytics standpoint, that we can tap into to try to decide what is the earliest or the oldest text that's available in regards to the New Testament text that we have, versus those that were changed later on due to theological biases or scribal errors or whatever it actually might be. The traditional goal of textual criticism was to reconstruct the original text, the initial text. When Paul wrote Romans, what was that original text like, down to the very word, and the punctuation? Modern textual critics have sort of decided that that may be a bit of a misnomer to say that we actually can deduce what the original text was. So they've come up with this concept of, the narrative textual criticism, where they study variants as windows into interpretive history, if you may. So you have these theological controversies within the early church, and you look at all the different textual variations in the New Testament. A lot of those are reflections of those theological debates that were going on within the actual church. And we're going to talk about a few of those during today's podcast. So, Greg, we talked about, a lot of stuff just now for our listeners. What is the significance for a contemporary Bible reader today?
I think some people will recognize the term autograph. You were talking about the original text. Well, we don't have those. Or if we did, we wouldn't know which of them among the piles that they would be. And so we're looking at trying to create a text from all of these manuscripts. So you put them all together and try to figure out what as you say, the initial rather than the original would be, but recognizing that Church A might have one and Church B might have the same letter from, let's say, Paul, but somebody in copying made a slight change in it, either mistaken or it could be an intentional because of their local situation. They made some sort of a change. And so one of the challenges for us today is that every modern translation that we read is based on text critical decisions. And by critical, we don't mean that we're criticizing it. It just means we're making a judgment about it. Which reading should we go with? And so what we find in some Bibles today are footnotes that give us a clue as to what some of the other textual variants are and what kind of a scholarly debate might be about it. You mentioned the passage about the adulterous woman in John.
Yeah.
Or the longer versus shorter ending to Mark. Well, what do I do with that? And should I read it? Should I read it in the place where it is? What do I do with this snake handling stuff that shows up at the longer ending to Mark? So the passages allow us to ask questions about why people would have included these. But then the footnotes that are showing up in Bibles, the text critical pieces to it, are giving us a little clue as to what some of those discussions are. So you don't have to kind of wonder where in the world this stuff came from. So printers are doing a better job at helping us understand.
Absolutely. Yeah, those footnotes in like the NRSV, the NIV, and so forth are extremely helpful to your point because they talk about the manuscript tradition and they boil it down in a way that's understandable to the lay reader.
And the more we understand about the history of how those manuscripts evolved, got passed down from one to the other, it helps to enrich our interpretation of whatever text that we're reading, but also develop more of an appreciation for what we're reading as scripture that has both a divine hand to it and a human hand to it. That God is working through people throughout the centuries.
Yeah.
And I don't see that as a problem, to say that God continues to work through the Spirit, through people in the church as they try to address situations of their day, coming back constantly to these key texts.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. Now I'll let you do a deep dive on Erasmus here in just a second, which is quite interesting in and of itself. as I mentioned before, for 1400 years, there was no printing press. You couldn't, stick it on the printing press and roll out, 50 copies of Paul's letter to the Romans, or, 100 copies of the book of Acts and distribute it to a bunch of different churches. It did not work that way. So until the Gutenberg invention, at least in the Western world, the Eastern world, they were a few centuries ahead of us, I think, when it came to the printing press. But, in the 1450s, until then, like I mentioned before, copies of the Bible were relegated to religious institutions, monasteries, and then the extremely wealthy people, because those are the ones who could actually afford to have a copy, and then they could read it within their homes. And it was most likely in Greek. It might be in Latin. It could be in Georgian and so forth, depending on the location of the world that you found yourself in. The earliest manuscripts, in the 2nd century, 3rd century, 4th century, typically are written in all capital letters called uncials. We may have we may throw that up as for those who are on YouTube, so you can actually see what that looks like. Minuscules is a more of a cursive writing that came along, the 5th, 6th century, and then most of our manuscripts are as minuscules thereafter. The printing press, we're going to talk about that a bit, standardized, gave us the actual Greek text that became available with our friend Erasmus. But it also sort of fixed in stone, a textual tradition that wasn't based on, the earliest manuscripts. It wasn't based on the most difficult readings, which is, 2 of the factors you bring into play when you're looking at textual variants. So that's something we're going to talk a little bit about as we get into the podcast. But before we do so, talk about the first printed Greek New Testament, 1516, by our friend Erasmus.
Well, I was going to ask you first, do you tend to write in uncial style or minuscule style? From college on, I shifted to an uncial style. I write in all caps. So maybe I've lost
my writing, so I'm not sure what I'm writing in.
It's probably best we just type, but don't type in all caps. That'll confuse people.
Very true.
So Erasmus, we have a lot of things that are happening in the 1500s. Of course, this is the period of the Protestant Reformation. We are going to be coming up in fairly short order on the Enlightenment. This is just a time where things are bursting out throughout Europe. And one of the key early scholars, it's a humanist scholar, Desiderius Erasmus, who's working in Basel, Switzerland. And he wanted to get out a printed Greek New Testament, she said, in 1516. Now, he was up against a deadline because he had heard there was this competition from the Spanish, who were producing a Complutensian polyglot. Polyglot is a multilingual Bible, so that you could address multilingualism. And it was supposed to be printed in 1514, but they couldn't because they couldn't get papal approval for it. Kind of hung it all up. And so here's Erasmus rushing to get things out. So his Greek New Testament is based on only 5 to 7, maybe 8 late, what we call Byzantine manuscripts. And we'll come back and talk about what we mean by Byzantine manuscripts that were available in his day in Basel. Wow. And those manuscripts, we would say, have hundreds of errors by today's standards. But for Erasmus, this is what he had to work with. And so one of the famous problems that he encountered was when he was trying to deal with Revelation. And there were passages from Revelation that were missing in the Greek manuscripts that he had. So what did he do? He took his Latin, which had been there for centuries by this point, and he translated the Latin backwards into Greek and used that in his Greek New Testament. I can't even imagine the number of errors that he introduced by doing that. So what he was really trying to do in creating this New Testament was to provide a scholarly tool alongside his new Latin translation. He never meant it as a definitive text, but it would be very influential. And he made
years,
and he made corrections in subsequent editions in 1519, 1522, 1527, 1535. So he recognized that it needed to be updated, but not everybody who perhaps came into ownership of one recognized the ongoing process.
Mhm.
And so
And that
that
became
leads us,
known as what? The Textus Receptus, Greg? You want to explain what that means?
right? So there are several editions that start coming out along with Erasmus that codify this set of Greek texts. One is by Robert F.J.A, who's sometimes known as Stephanus, and he had 4 different editions between 1546 and 1551, where he started incorporating more manuscripts, much like Erasmus was doing. He had a very famous 1551 edition. Can you guess what made it so famous? He put verses in.
Ah,
Before that, we
you mean those
had
aren't
those.
original? I
I
thought Paul
know
wrote those.
it's Moses was up on the mountain putting those things in the Old Testament. Somebody else, maybe Peter, came along and sat for. Maybe that's what Paul was doing out in Syria. He was putting in those verses.
The versification process we learned
Versification,
there.
yeah.
Yeah.
So those are still with us today, and sometimes those verses fall in the strangest places, but we won't get too much onto Stephanus. Another person who was making up a text was Theodore Beza. He had several revisions between 1565 and 1604 based on even more additional manuscripts. The Elsevier brothers in 1633 came out with an edition that was marketed as the text received by all, Textus Receptus,
Receptus. Ah.
the text that is received. And so this is how we essentially get Erasmus's text, because all these people are following Erasmus, as the Textus Receptus that becomes the basic Greek text for which other translations are being done. But the problem is that it had a very limited manuscript base, and they were almost all entirely late manuscripts from, say, the 11th century of the Byzantine side of the spectrum. These are manuscripts that are associated with the Eastern Church out of Byzantium, Constantinople.
Yeah.
So how does the Textus Receptus impact us in the Western Church? What happens as this becomes the accepted Greek translation?
Well, it filtered down into all the other translations, right? So that's a great segue. I think you're throwing me a softball and I wasn't catching it very well. So you're right. The Reformation era text all reflect this late manuscript Textus Receptus Byzantine tradition that doesn't factor in. We're going to talk about some of the early manuscripts, and there's some interesting stories there, as our listeners will find out in a moment. But you have like the King James Version in 1611. It's based on this late manuscript tradition that has all these additional texts, the woman caught in adulteries and all those texts in John chapter 7, I guess it is. You have, we already talked about the piece in Luke 22. You have the long ending of Mark and so forth. And it's just not the King James Version. You have the German Lutheran Bible, same thing. And essentially for about 300 years, this late Byzantine Textus Receptus Greek manuscript output ends up being the basis for all these different translations of the Bible that proliferated during the Reformation period. And there's this concept of provincial preservation that sort of held sway during this 300-year period that served as an argument for the authority of the Textus Receptus. But, as you're going to describe momentarily, there were some challenges or cracks began to appear in this manuscript tradition, Greek manuscript tradition, and then it really opened up, with our friend Tischendorf, who I will talk about in a moment.
Yeah, I had a fellow years ago when we met up in Berkeley, I was taking the train up, and a fellow at the train station got into a rather heated, heated's not, he was very energetically defending the King James Version as the received text and that we should not deviate at all from it. So People still hold strongly to that text. I even know people who pray in King James.
Very true.
That's
Yeah.
the only language that they know. But Textus Receptus had some challenges, and that came particularly as people started finding more manuscripts. And the 1700s, 1800s is a time of great, shall we say, conquest, exploration by Europeans, and they start finding manuscripts sometimes by the thousands, trying to then update our understanding of what the ancient Greek texts look like. So there's a fellow by the name of John Mill, not to be confused with John Stuart Mill, who's a different fellow, who in 1707 created the first edition of Novum Testamentum Grecum.
Mm.
And it had over 30,000 variants coming from only 100 manuscripts.
Wow.
So these manuscripts suddenly introduced a lot of variations that people now had to take into account. Another fellow by the name of Richard Bentley had a proposal for reforming the text based on comparing ancient texts. And he's considered one of the fathers of philology in classical literature. So this isn't a problem, it's a challenge for the New Testament. It really has to do with all ancient literature, that we're finding these texts, and now what do we do with the variations? Johann Albrecht Bengel's pioneering text critical principles came out in 1734. And perhaps the most important thing that he said was, before the easy reading stands the difficult. So the tendency of people who are copying texts are going to take a difficult reading and they're going to smooth it out. So the difficult reading stands
Human
first.
nature. Yeah.
You always want to smooth it. You don't usually intentionally make it more difficult, that unless you get a really bad sense of humor. Now, Griesbach, Johann Jakob Griesbach, had a critical edition 1775 to 1807, and he came up with a method using text types plus canons of criticism, rules for criticism. And so he ended up coming up with 3 editions, and he proposed that these manuscripts fell into 3 families. One is the Alexandrian tradition, another one is the Western tradition, and the third is the Byzantine, associated with Constantinople, Byzantium, the Asiatic side. And Griesbach's preference was for Alexandrian tradition, things obviously associated with Egypt. Karl Lockman in 1831, so we're really coming close to the modern age, is the first major break from the Textus Receptus based on what he considered to be scientific principles. How do we decide between readings? And he also embraced the Alexandrian family of manuscripts. And so what we have is an increasing catalog of manuscripts challenging the Textus Receptus readings. And so not only do we now have new manuscripts, now we're going to have to change the translation. And so this, of course, we have people who for centuries have gotten used to a reading, like my friend with the King James. And so there's bitter scholarly and churchly theological battles over revising what has come to be known as the Textus Receptus, or the traditional text of the church. But these aren't the only discoveries. There are other landmark discoveries. Tell us a little bit about some of the codices that were found.
And some great stories on top of that. Greg, to your point about the families, it might just be, that's actually really important, the Griesbachian tripart division into Alexandrian, Western, and Byzantine traditions, because that really held sway until just most recently. And then we've seen a few cracks, and we'll talk a bit about that a little later in the podcast. But, you know, grouping them into those families, and then, you know, you take these manuscript traditions and it has enough resemblance to other manuscripts in that family. Oh, it must be Alexandrian, we put it here. But then you have different tiers in each of those families and so forth. And then suddenly, you know, one family, one manuscript may have a lot of similarities with that family, but suddenly it has similarities with another family, and that's where the cracks have appeared recently.
Much like you would do with a family tree.
Exactly.
So, you get your nose from this side of the family and your ears from this side of the family. And so you can kind of tell some of these variations by these family resemblances.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. So I think one of the modern discoveries that I find most fascinating, I remember I told a few of my technology compatriots at Sun Microsystems and Symantec this story, and they find it fascinating, is the discovery of Codex Sinaiticus, obviously found in Sinai. And it was discovered by this fellow, a German guy by the name of Konstantin Tischendorf, who made 3 visits to St. Catherine's Monastery on the Sinai Peninsula. And at the time, and after he visited, they finally did away with this particular way in which you would gain entry into the monastery. But they had this, wasn't a phone booth per se, but it had this little booth, and you would call up to the monastery with a chain or whatever, and you would tell them you're there, your visit, and you would give them the actual letter authorizing your visit. And then if they decided, yeah, Greg can actually visit us, or in this case, Tischendorf, they would put you in a bucket and they would winch you up. I think it was, I forgot how many feet, it was 100 feet or something, up into the actual monastery. And our friend Tischendorf visited St. Catherine's on 3 occasions, 1844, 53, and then 59. And during his first visit there, this is what he says. Now you read what some of the monks say later on. They sort of contradict what Tischendorf said. So you have to decide who you're actually going to believe. But Tischendorf said that he saw, a pile of, of paper, of manuscripts, parchments that were sitting by the fire. The monks were cold. It was the winter. They wanted to warm themselves. And he figured out that, gee, they're about to burn copies of, as it turned out, probably the oldest manuscript at that point in time of the New Testament, Codex Sinaiticus. And he got 43 parchment leaves. And he got so darn excited about the discovery that he alarmed the monks, because the monks said, this guy shouldn't be this excited about, this kindling. They're going to throw a fire to stay warm. So he wasn't able to get the whole thing out of there during his first visit. He came back 3 times, and on his third trip, he had gotten the attention of Tsar Alexander, and the Tsar had signed something to get him in, and they did a bit of wrangling and negotiation and so forth. And he signed a receipt for 347 leaves of the manuscript, which was finalized in 1869. It's housed in, I think I said German, he's actually Russian, obviously. I need to get my nationalities correct. It's housed in St. Petersburg, and the monks in exchange received some special recognition from the Tsar at the time. Now, as I said, depending on who you read, the story varies a little bit in terms of how he actually found them. Did he pilfer them? Did he hoodwink them and so forth? And was the actual handing over of the manuscripts, completely ethical? That our listeners can read about in other resources, obviously. That's a whole show in and of itself. The manuscript is significant because it's from the 4th century, probably the early part of the 4th century. And as I said, at that point in time is the oldest manuscript of the Greek New Testament that had been discovered. And it had the complete New Testament, portions of the Septuagint, which is the Greek Old Testament. It had some non-canonical text in there as well. The Epistle of Barnabas, Shepherd of Hermas, Tobit, Sirach, 1st and 2nd Maccabees, which are extremely important documents, Wisdom of Solomon. And at that point in time, the world was extremely excited about the discovery. Now, there's something else called the Codex Vaticanus, and our audience can guess where that was found. That was over in the Vatican. Greg, tell us a bit about its discovery and what it contained and why it's extremely important for New Testament textual studies.
The Vatican has such enormous holdings, and we don't know where everything comes from. Now, someone in the Vatican may know. And so with Vaticanus, it gets first cataloged in 1475, but its origins still remain a mystery. So where did this come from? Don't know. Scholars were denied access until the mid-19th century. Some people were alleging that they examined it secretly. And anytime you have secrets, you get all kinds of stories that come about. And the Vatican was, particularly in the 15, 16, 1700s, really reluctant to sharing this particular treasure with Protestant scholars. There's still a lot of tension going on. But Cardinal Mai had a flawed edition that finally came out in 1858.
Mm.
And when they eventually published photographic facsimiles, which are wonderful because now you can share those things, they realized that his edition of it had some problems. So they started to correct it. And what they discovered is that Vaticanus seems to be a distinctive text type that often stands alone against those other families that we talked about, against the majority readings. And this became much more well known once those facsimiles came out in 1889, 90.
Yeah.
And so, when we get these kinds of things coming to light, then we have more people who can look at it and can assess their value for us. But there are so many other discoveries. So what about the Chester Beatty papyri?
Yeah, and just I'm not sure if you called this out. The Vaticanus dates somewhere the same time frame as Sinaiticus. The early
Right.
part of the fourth century. I think
Very
some
ancient.
scholars date it slightly older than Sinaiticus. It depends on who you're talking to, but it's an ancient manuscript and added. It was a huge discovery, and certainly its publication and dissemination of the scholarly world was. So to answer your question, Chester Beatty, back in the 1930s, there's this businessman and collector named, no surprise with the last name Beatty, Alfred Chester Beatty. He acquired from some Egyptian dealers some jars of manuscripts, most likely from a Coptic graveyard that had a lot of manuscripts contained within them. And these manuscripts dated from anywhere the early part of the 2nd century into the 4th century, depending on the manuscript in question. Like I said, it was buried in the Egyptian desert, which is dry, in these jars. So that, hence the reason they were preserved for a long period of time. If they'd been in Europe, they wouldn't have survived. You don't have papyri discoveries in Germany or France for that matter. Unless they're in some hermetically contained container that doesn't allow any moisture to come in. It includes P45, which is a valuable manuscript. It has portions of all 4 Gospels, Acts. It dates from the 3rd century. P46, the papyri are designated with a P in front of the number, papyri 46. Paul's letters, also Hebrews. And it has an interesting order where Hebrews is placed directly after Romans, probably with the premise that Paul wrote. Hebrews,
yeah.
most likely. As P47, we're going in sequence here. A significant portion of Revelation. Erasmus probably wished he had that. He wouldn't have had to do his reverse translation from the 3rd century as well. And there's a couple reasons why the Chester Beatty papyri discoveries were important. First of all, they're early date. They're from the 2nd and 3rd century, P45, 46, 47, some of the other manuscripts that were uncovered. Minor variations with Sinaiticus as well as Vaticanus shows that we have a text that was relatively stable, or that's the argument of scholars, that it wasn't going through dramatic changes, at least within that time frame, because you have something that's from the 2nd century that looks very close to what we had published in the case of Sinaiticus and Vaticanus in the 4th century. And then third, Christians these were codices. We're using codices a little earlier than most scholars believed was the case. And like I said, that's a show in and of itself. In fact, we'll probably have a guest on for that one. There's been a couple books written on that subject recently in terms of how, early Christians read scripture in groups and in church settings and so forth. So that's one set of papyri. There's another set of papyri, Greg, called the Bodmer. Tell us a bit about those.
Yeah, the Bodmer papyri, which came about in the 1950s and 60s, is named for a Swiss collector, Martin Bodmer. These papyri now are referred to as the Dishna papers from the place where they were found in Egypt, in part because the Bodmer collection isn't whole anymore. It's been parceled out to various places. So people are referring to it as the Dishna papers. They were discovered in Egypt, and oh, goodness, they were smuggled out. So many of these findings were smuggled out. You made the comment about Tischendorf needing to go up in some sort of a
Bucket
elevator
rope.
bucket rope. I've seen one of those in the monasteries in Matera, Greece, where you have to go up that way. But some of these aren't found up in monasteries hiding away in some library. Sometimes they're found in garbage dumps, or they're stuck in a jar buried in the ground, or in a for some of the Jewish texts, sometimes they're in a place where you put sacred scriptures that have outlived their usefulness. They've started to fall apart, but you can't destroy them, so they get put into a geniza. So we find these things in all kinds of interesting places, and so have to wonder where they're digging around finding some of these papyri. So with the Bodmer papyri, we have one P66 that has a nearly complete Gospel of John that dates from around 200 CE. That's so early, especially if you think that John was written somewhat late. I mean, it puts it very, very ancient. P75 has Luke and John from the early 3rd century as well. That shows remarkable agreement with Vaticanus that we were just talking about, suggesting some conservative copying practices, that there's continuity here. P75 also specifically revolutionized understanding of how Luke's gospel was transmitted, in which there's 94% agreement with Vaticanus. And so Vaticanus seems to be preserving an early and very reliable text for us. So that's, for those people who are Lucan scholars, this is very, very helpful. But again, there's lots of other papyri that are found. There's at least another 140 that have been discovered to date. Papyri come from Egypt. It's made by the papyrus reed. The Oxyrhynchus papyri is a massive collection, which includes one, 5575, with sayings of Jesus that come from Matthew, Luke, as well as Thomas, which is, this papyrus seems to be from the late 2nd century, and it was found in a dump. So somebody had somehow gotten rid of it in this fashion, not treating it as terribly sacred, it would appear. So this collection also includes other early Christian works, such as the New Testament pseudepigrapha. Boy, that's a mouthful. We're going to have to do a whole session on the pseudepigrapha, which is just so much fun. The overall collection of the Oxyrhynchus papyri is really quite diverse, and it includes things like edicts, census data, court records, business accounts, private letters, religious writings, and more. So maybe that's why it ended up in the dump. Somebody was just doing some spring cleaning and just getting rid of this stuff.
I don't want to pay these bills. I'm going to throw them in the dump.
That's right. The Willoughby papyrus has John 1:49 to chapter 2:1, which comes from the 3rd or 4th century. And what's unusual, it's written on the front side of the scroll. And for a while, it was hidden away in a man's attic, Willoughby. And it was tucked in a suitcase belonging to this former University of Chicago professor, who was professor of early Christian origins, Harold Willoughby. And after his passing, out comes this suitcase, and sure enough, there's something written on the front side, but there's also something written on the back side. But to read it, instead of flipping it like a page, you have to flip it top to bottom.
Yeah.
Which is just not the right way to flip things. And so you have to turn it this 180 degrees for the text to be right side up. And so this is a really unique orientation that makes people think that the physical evidence means that it was once part of a scroll rather than a codex. So that it was rolled one way, and for some reason it got turned and was written on the other side. Codices, you wouldn't do that because you flip them like pages.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
sometimes the material that it's written on and the way that the text comes out tells us a lot about the particular document that we're looking at.
That's
So,
fascinating. Oh.
but let's
So
tell a little
Greg, you
bit
have
more about
all
the
this
families.
manuscript
Yeah.
tradition, and then as we alluded to, and we sort of talked about this already, so I won't spend too much time on it. You need to group them into families, or that's what Griesbach and Lachmann and others begin to do. And you had Westcott Hort, we'll talk about them here in a moment, two Anglican scholars that came out with really the first Greek New Testament that is based on these early Greek manuscripts, and tends to side by the more difficult readings, which you talked about a bit already. But you have the Alexandrian text, you have the Western text, you have the Byzantine text in terms of these three family groups, which until recently scholars were relatively in consensus about the grouping. They might disagree as to which manuscript goes where, but the Alexandrian text usually seen as Sinaiticus, the early papyri, Vaticanus, and so forth represent it. It's characterized typically by shorter readings. Usually, when you have two readings, one's more difficult, then the more difficult reading is going to fall into the Alexandrian text. And by the name, it's obviously associated with Egypt, typically. The papyri would fall into this bucket as well. Western text, it's marked by paraphrases, harmonizations. We're trying to harmonize the accounts within the Gospels. And I think you're going to talk a bit about one of those examples a little later on in the podcast. Has both additions and omissions, both possibly from less controlled copy environments where there weren't as many strict controls, thus you could harmonize passages and so forth. And then you have the Byzantine text, which is later 9th century and on, as you mentioned. It's standardized. The readings are much easier. They're not, if there's differences in the variants, it's going to choose most likely represent the easier, smoother reading that solves the difficulties in the more difficult readings. And talk a bit about you have these groupings, but then you also have all these markings and so forth that begin to show up in the manuscripts, which are quite interesting in and of themselves.
Right. For some that are used as part of a regular church service, they have ecphonic notations marking out how the text should be chanted. There's lection markings showing where readings begin and end for church services. The Eusebian canons and section divisions help locate parallel gospel passages. So if you've got a parallel within a text or between the gospels.
Wow.
There's larger script and formatting for public readings versus private study copies. So if you're standing up, you need a slightly bigger text in front of you. And there's lots of evidence of wear on particular passages that are frequently used in worship, where your fingers are touching it and moving it. When I preach, I often put my finger on my passage where I'm at so I don't lose it. That's what happens when you wear trifocals.
Yeah.
But we also find scribal corrections that indicate not just errors, scribal error, but some theological concerns. So some of the things that we see in the physical material is different ink colors showing multiple correctors over the centuries.
Mm-hmm.
Marginal notes disputing particular readings. Theological, quote, improvements reflecting doctrinal debates. People aren't quite happy with it, so we're going to update it a little bit.
We're going to fix it.
We're going to fix it. Yeah. And of course, harmonization that you mentioned, showing a desire for consistency between gospels. Why would they tell it in different ways? And these show up with pretty good regularity. And so the desire to harmonize is very strong. So here's a case study in Luke 32 and early Christology. The Western chapter 3 verse chapter 3 verse 22. The Western reading, Western family of texts is, "You're my son, today I have begotten you," which is a direct quote from Psalm 2 verse 7. Versus, "You are my beloved son, in whom I am well pleased," which sounds like what you would hear at baptism. Matthew's gospel would say something like that.
Yeah.
How this variant potentially reflects adoptionist versus incarnational Christology is part of those debates. So if you're reading, I've begotten you versus you're my son and I'm pleased in you, one sounds more
different things.
like you're adopted. Yeah. And so, of course, you can make all kinds of hay out of that. And there's evidence in early figures like Justin Martyr and Clement and other church writers that they are aware of these kinds of issues. And so it's an example of how variants serve as windows into some of those theological discussions, putting it politely, that we sometimes are somewhat removed from. We have our own discussions today. So the physical artifact itself, as I've mentioned, can be very important. These things are not cheap. It's expensive to produce, whether it's a papyrus or a parchment, and it means that the community has to invest in scriptures. Whoever is owning these, either a private individual or a local ecclesiastical community. The wear patterns show which texts were frequently used or more so than others. Sometimes the size and format revealed a public or private use, depending on the size of the font. The material is a clue to the date to some degree. One of the reasons that we have parchment instead of papyri is that at one point in the city of Pergamum, John writes about Pergamum in what is today Western Turkey. They were trying to build a library that was in direct competition to the library in Alexandria.
Yeah.
So when the Egyptians found out that they were doing this, they cut off supply of papyri to them. Well, how are you going to have a library if you can't get the paper to write on? And so they created their own Pergamum paper, parchment. That's where we get that term, which is made out of dried animal skins. Yeah. And so that can tell you a little bit about location. Papyri are probably going to be more from Egypt. Parchment is something that is created in the 2nd century BC up in Turkey, or West Anatolia would have been at that point. So David Parker had a crucial insight that the manuscripts, the physical material, are not only transmitters of the tradition, sometimes they are the tradition itself. There's a whole tradition of the printed material, printed however you're coming across.
So you have all these early manuscripts that are being discovered, papyri discoveries and so forth. Obviously, in the late 1800s, you don't have the papyri yet, but you have Vaticanus, you have Sinaiticus, you have a number of other uncials, as well as early minuscule manuscripts that have been discovered. The snowball, if you may, or the things are starting to move in the direction that this Textus Receptus isn't the Greek text that we really want to rely on.
Exactly.
For understanding the Greek New Testament, also all these translations that we're making from it. So these two Anglicans, Westcott and Hort, in 1881, they decided the Alexandrian text, using Sinaiticus and Vaticanus and so forth, as the primary manuscript tradition, are most likely representative of the earliest manuscript tradition. They decided you had 4 families. I don't think this 4-family grouping, which built on what Griesbach did, lasted that long, because everyone decided the neutral and the Alexandrian text are one and the same. But they said there's the Alexandrian text, there's this neutral text that they said was represented by Sinaiticus and Vaticanus. Alexandrian was represented by Ephraimi, which is manuscript E, minuscule manuscript 33, among others. And then you had the Byzantine, or they called it Syrian manuscript family, and then the Western manuscript family. And they came up with this concept of the shorter reading is to be preferred. So if you have a longer passage, use the ending of the Gospel of Mark, right? You have the long ending, you have the short
ending.
Exactly. Oversimplifying things a bit, but they would favor the shorter reading that ends in Mark 16:8. Then you have the Nestle Aland edition, which came out in 1898. We're now on the 28th edition. You and I were talking about this last night. I think when we were back in university, we were dealing with the 26th edition. The 2 editions have come out since then. The 28th came out in 2012. It really was revolutionized with the 21st edition that was overseen by a German scholar by the name of Kurt Aland, where he started to factor in these papyri discoveries. And, up until then, papyri really weren't factored into the New Testament Greek, the Greek New Testaments that we had. But with this 21st edition, he began to factor in all these papyri that you just talked about. And he also employed a bit of a more eclectic method, maybe because of the papyri discoveries versus Westcott and Hort. He looked at the age and quality manuscripts, the geographical distribution, internal considerations in terms of what's going on within that text itself, that manuscript. And then we have, I'm going to get done here in a moment, I promise, the United Bible Society's text. There's 5 of those. It's intended for, it's very similar to the Nestle-Aland text, with minor variations here and there, but it's intended for translators, pastors, and students. The apparatus, if you may be, is a bit easier if those who have taken Greek New Testament courses before and you've used both, you'll know that the Nestle-Aland is much more difficult, but it also has a lot more variants embedded within it than the UBS text has. It's virtually identical. The 5th edition that was published in 2014, 2 years after the Nestle-Aland 28th edition came out. A few little minor variations here and there. Selective critical apparatus, like I said, there is a textual commentary. Bruce Metzger, famous Princeton, right? Getting another, I think, Princeton scholar. It's been too long since I've been to university.
Yep, that's right.
That he wrote, that is used as an accompanying commentary to all the various textual variants in the New Testament, that is a companion to the UBS text. They're scored, one last thing, it's kind of interesting, on a scale of A to D. D being the committee has great difficulty in arriving at any kind of decision at all. And with the 5th edition, what's interesting is only one, it's like less than 1% of all the variants, which is like 10, are grouped as D. So as UBS has progressed from, particularly the 3rd, 4th, and 5th editions, the number of readings that were grouped as D readings, where, they're very highly uncertain, has grown smaller and smaller. We're going to talk about a few of those briefly in a moment. And you have C readings, which are described as the committee had difficulty, deciding which variant to place. Of all the variants, there's about 25% or 354 that fall into that bucket. B, text is almost certain, but with a small degree of doubt. 38% fall there, 523. And then A is basically the text is certain. It's 30, sort of like the Textus Receptus for your friend.
Yes.
36%, 505 fall into that bucket. So, Greg, let's talk a bit about, how there's been an evolution or transformation, or how you want to describe in terms of how we approach these textual variants, particularly with the introduction of digital technologies.
Exactly. There is so much that we can do now with the electronic media. Computing skills have increased the storage, the recognition, comparison. Things have just changed radically. So one of the things that has started to affect a lot of things dealing with ancient manuscripts, not just New Testament, but ancient, is technological advance in scanning the images. So multispectral imaging, I can say this, help to reveal erased text, which we call palimpsest, where you erase the text in a fashion with an animal skin. You might scrape it off and then you write over it, but it still would leave some marks. And so it shows some of the damaged portions, and you can read what was under it. There's also now digital repositories that make manuscripts globally accessible, things like the Virtual Manuscript Room, or the CSNTM, the Center for the Study of New Testament Manuscripts, where you can go in and you can click on which manuscript you want, and up pops this image. So you can actually see the physical well, an image of the physical piece there. It's not just something that somebody's printed in a book like,
Yeah.
right. So now you can actually see the ancient manuscript. So with that, you can do statistical analyses of text relationships that was just not possible before computing. You can, and I don't understand this. Tech is your area. It's certainly not mine. I can answer my phone. That's about it these days. So now the computer can do a lot more work, but because it's now computerized and made available, we can crowdsource things like transcriptions. We can get non-specialists involved. It's no longer a cottage industry for a person to hang on to a set of manuscripts and get them out over decades. And so things can happen so much quicker. They've got a new, I find this one very fascinating, a 3D image of damaged manuscripts like the Herculaneum papyri, where they are perhaps still rolled, but badly damaged, deeply embedded in, I was going to say volcanic matter in some of these places that have undergone volcanic eruptions, or they were burned in some fashion. And they can 3D scan these things and layer by layer go in and see what was written on those without ever trying to open them up and thereby destroying them.
Just trying out.
So yeah, I know in classics, this has just had some very exciting discoveries. So New Testament is right there with it. Another method, though, that is related to what we can do with computer technology is the coherence-based genealogical method, CBGM. I know it's a mouthful. It's out of the Institute in Munich. It's developed by a single person, Gerd Mink, at the Institute for New Testament Textual Research, and it's a computer-assisted analysis establishing genealogical relationships between variants rather than just manuscripts. When we talk about these families of manuscripts, it's like whole manuscripts. But the variants might actually cross over families, where a person might have in front of them several manuscripts as they're creating a new one, and they might be borrowing from each of those. So any variation might be jumping family lines.
Yeah.
And so his method overcomes some of the problem of manuscript contamination when you copy from multiple exemplars. And if a text coheres better as a precursor to an earlier manuscript, this method could help with this. And it prioritizes different textual relationships over manuscript age. So you might have a late manuscript, a Byzantine manuscript, which people don't pay as much attention to, that are actually more reliable by this method than some of the ancient ones.
That's a great point, because these are manuscripts, minuscule manuscripts from 9th, 10th, 11th, 12th, 13th century that in recent years weren't really paid much attention to, because we thought it was Byzantine, fully Byzantine. Thus, as a result, all the readings in it are late, right? And they're going to be contaminated. They're not going to be part of that original or the early text, if you may. But because of this, scholars are beginning to understand there's actual nuggets, if you may, in some of those later manuscripts.
Exactly. So one of the examples is in the Catholic epistles. In the Nestle Aland 28, they have some Byzantine manuscripts that contain earlier iterations. So there's maybe 10 to 12 revisions. And it also happens in Acts, where 36 of 52 revisions align with Byzantine readings. They actually went with these older manuscript readings that by this method, they were viewed as more reliable. One example is Jude 5, where there's an issue whether it should read Jesus or the Lord. So this allows them to weigh in on that. 2 Peter 3:10, the Greek manuscripts attest a line that has said, will be found or exposed, but now this method is saying will not be found. So it flips it the other direction. Now, what's weird about this one is that there are no Greek manuscripts that attest this reading.
Wow.
It comes from a few Coptic and Syriac manuscripts. Now, the whole reading is works that are on it. This is coming from 2 Peter 3:10. Works that are on it will be burned up, is how one of the translations that I grabbed read. Works that are on it will not be found, or they will be found. Well, that's a huge difference.
Yeah.
And my own judgment would be I always go with the Greek manuscripts. I'm not sure I'm going to be willing to go with a later Coptic or Syriac text. But this is part of what this is pushing us to consider.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Interesting.
So there are limitations and scholarly critiques of his method. One of the main drawbacks is that the promised precision is probably more apparent than real. The theoretical basis for this is really the work of one person, and the technique has only been applied to the Catholic epistles. So there's a lot more of the New Testament that needs to be tested on. And so tests and figuring out whether it's actually operating the way that it's being claimed it needs to be done. And the whole approach isn't very well understood outside of Munster, where it's located.
In Germany.
So not a lot of people have borrowed on this, and it's not borrowing from things like classical stematics or from phylogenetics and biology, these kinds of things that have been tested and used more. And so it's an unproven method. And we just have to wait to find out whether it's going to work. At the beginning of any new approach, as exciting and promising as it can be, it might work and it might not. So we have to give it time. Don't put too much weight on it, but watch it. So this gets us back to our question that we opened with is, what about this shift from original text to initial text concepts?
Yeah, well, that's a great point, Greg. And we talked a bit about this where, with all these different manuscripts and the intersections between the different manuscript families, scholars, we don't have anything that's original, right? We don't have, show me Paul's letter to the Romans. We've been picking on Paul and Romans throughout this show. We don't have the original letter, and it might be that Paul produced several, because there's a lot of different house churches. You read Romans 16, he may have produced multiple copies of that letter that were disseminated to multiple churches in Rome that may have not been exactly the same, right? So,
but all would have been original.
Precisely. So saying we have the original text, we don't. Are we able to lock it back or walk back to the point where, we analyze all the different manuscripts and we're able to definitively say this is the original text? Maybe in some instances, I guess, but really we're talking about the initial text or the early text that we have, or the earliest text that we have, that can be recovered, basically. And this is a recognition in New Testament textual criticism that really has come about in the last 25, 30 years, maybe more recent than that, where we now recognize that original text probably is not something that's attainable, but we can walk it back to, these initial texts that existed. Now, when you're using methodology, you talk about these new cool methodologies using digital capabilities and so forth. There's a lot of promise there, obviously. But if you're a pastor or you're a lay leader and you're looking at a text that has a significant variant in it, maybe it's even a minor variant, you typically want to look at a couple different issues. External evidence. You're going to give more weight to the older manuscripts, Vaticanus, the papyri, Sinaiticus, and so forth. If you have geographical distribution in the reading, then that's going to afford greater likelihood that it's part of that initial text that we're trying to seek. Internal evidence, harder readings, obviously in most cases because we have a predilection to smooth over things, to make it easier to harmonize and so forth. And then shorter readings, right? We're going to tend to pontificate, or I do anyway, on certain subjects. It's getting longer and longer and longer, in most instances anyway. And then, this concept of genealogy, right? Genealogical analysis, which variant best explains, all the other variants that exist, or as many of the other variants that exist, as well as the origins of a particular reading. What maybe gave premise to it? Was it a controversy around Christology or Trinitarian controversy in the 2nd or 4th centuries and so forth? And that's where you can pinpoint where that variant actually arose. Now, we've seen all this coalescing into a greater, for the most part, degree of optimism around the text of the New Testament. We have a lot of manuscripts to begin with. Kent Clark's analysis, he looked at the UBS. We talked a bit about that a moment ago, and there are A, B, C, and D ratings of certain, and there's a committee that votes on these things for the UBS text, of certain or almost certain, which would be A and B, doubled for UBS 1 through 3 to UBS 4 from 31% to almost 3/4, 74%. That's a substantial increase when you think about it. So there's that. The number of D ratings, which I alluded to a moment ago, which are highly uncertain, it's dropped to 10 in the UBS 5. It had in UBS 3, which doesn't go back that far. I think UBS 3, when I first started college, we were using UBS 3. I had 144. So from 144 to 10. UBS 6, we'll see if it drops to 5. We'll have to see. One interesting example is Luke 19:25. Jump from a D rating, which is highly debated. We're not sure, this variant, could go either way, to an A rating in UBS 5. And this occurred without, we must have uncovered some fabulous new old manuscript that, validated this reading. So we were able to jump from a D to an A. No new manuscript evidence. And it goes from, and they said to him, Lord, he has 10 minutes, is omitted in D, which is Codex Beza, which is not an early manuscript, W69, etc. It's seen as a harmonization with Matthew 25 that leaves it out. So it's an interesting change there. No new manuscript evidence, but they've jumped from a D to an A.
So they've gotten more willing to accept that it was a harmonization.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
So all right. Well,
this has an impact on all our translations. Everyone's probably asking, well, what translation, Greg, should I use? King James? You've already told me that's probably based on Textus Receptus. But I'm trying to recover that initial text, unless I want to read, very late Greek manuscripts, and including in Revelation some translations from the Latin. I probably want to look for some other translations. What's available? What do you recommend?
Well, there are all kinds of texts that are translations that are based on critical editions. And while I may agree with choices that different ones make, some of the ones that are fairly accessible, the ESV, the NIV, we tend to get to know these by their initials, right? The New International Version, the NASB, the New American Standard Bible, the NRSV, which we had our students use for a long time, New Revised Standard Version. And there's several of these variations out there. These are all based on critical texts, and they will give you some sort of notation. If you get a copy that has footnotes or marginal notes, it'll clue you in a little bit of what they're doing. And what may be best is to use a number of these, and especially if you can access it online, you can get some of these translations in parallel fashion, different online tools. There are new things that are out there. The majority text, which the World English Bible and MSB add variant notes with critical editions, which is, again, if you get the tools, then you know why they're making the choices and whether you agree with it or not. So reading critical apparatuses in various kinds of study Bibles, scholarly editions, even commentaries, where you can look up what the issues are, and you can have a basic understanding of what some of the rules might be. She said from the we tend to go from the easier reading to the harder reading to the easier, from the shorter to the longer. What you can begin to look at what decisions they've made in these translations, and start to make it for yourself.
No, those are some good suggestions, and I think not relying on just one translation is a good suggestion. And there's some great study Bibles out there that have really good footnotes. Some don't have great footnotes, but others do. Oxford Annotated was one of my more favorite for the New Revised Standard Version.
Yes, that's
for sure.
That's in fact the edition that we use for college students for a long time.
And there's a lot of textual variants. We will do a couple shows, later shows on a few of these, but just to whet the appetite of our readers, you all start off, the longer reading of Mark, which talks about handling snakes and everything else, kind of weird stuff, quite frankly. Those are all later manuscripts, not early manuscripts. The earliest manuscripts all end with Mark 16:8 with a participle, actually, with the participle for, which is an odd way to end. And there's not it seems to everyone flees and leaves and there's no one left. But there's been a lot of argument from a narrative standpoint, literary standpoint, that there's other similar narratives from the Greco-Roman world that end that way from the 1st and 2nd centuries. Analysis of the Markan text itself would seem to explain an ending that would end with 16:8. So anyone who's looking at the Gospel of Mark, you need to explore that manuscript tradition, the textual variants, have a good Bible study Bible with those footnotes, and communicate that to your congregants and the people that you're teaching. That's one that certainly will come up if someone's looking at text critical issues. Greg, you mentioned this already. The woman caught in adultery is another one.
Yeah, we have to do episode that we cover some of these because these are really juicy texts. And one of the problems with this particular passage is that the manuscript evidence shows that it was clearly not an original part of John's gospel. And if that's not weird enough, there's a few other things that are strange.
It moves around.
It moves around. It wasn't in a Greek manuscript before the 5th century that we have so far. And so at times it comes after John 36, after John 7:44, even after 21:25, or clear over in Luke's gospel. So this is a passage that seems to be floating out there. So what are we going to do with this? What's the internal evidence of it, of how you read this? Does it fit with the rest of the story? Is it unique? How many unique words are there in this passage? There are at least 14 that are found nowhere else in John's gospel. Suddenly he's using some different vocabulary. But there are some people who in the ancient world were already suggesting that it was part of John. So again, we'll have to come back to this one in a later episode to unpack this a little bit more. It's a passage that is really good for looking at text criticism issues.
Yeah, definitely. I'm not going to go into detail on this other one I wrote down, Luke 22, 43, and 44, because I think we can do a separate show on that. But it's certainly contested. There was a move to deem it as probably not part of that initial early textual tradition. It was added later on, but actually in the last decade or so, and I've written an article where I argued for its inclusion. There's been a number of others who've argued for its inclusion. So the pendulum is sort of swung back sort of in the middle. So you have some people who say it's part of that initial textual tradition, whereas you have others who say it isn't. And then there's this passage in 1 John, the Trinitarian formula that is also highly contested and probably not part of that initial early text, right, Greg?
Right. So in the Luke passage, it's Jesus sweating blood or drops like blood. It's a interesting passage. But in John, in 1 John, what we have are, there are 3 that bear record in heaven: the Father, the Word, and the Holy Spirit. These 3 are one, right? This is a great kind of churchly statement that you would say during a church service.
Yeah. Confession.
So you would understand why people would be drawn to this. The water, the blood, and the earth, the spirit, the water, and the blood. This is great. No. I think I still got that wrong. 3 that bear witness on earth. first spirit, second water, third blood. Got to get these right. I'm doing Lutheran services these days. I should have this
Yeah, you
Father,
should be
Son, and the Holy
immersed in
Spirit
all
down by
these.
now. Uh, Still get tongue-tied. Oh,
Well, we could talk ad nauseum about this. We had a couple things sort of wrap up the show. Why is New Testament textual criticism important? Just sort of recapping our longer discussion. I'll start it and then you can hop in. It builds confidence in the reliability of the biblical text, understanding that, quite frankly, the meticulous process of textual criticism. It's a whole practice in of itself. It helps demonstrate that we have confidence in the New Testament text we have today. We don't have those original manuscripts, but we have a textual tradition that shows stability early on in the second, third, and fourth centuries, a coalescence around variants in that tradition. For the most part, you're obviously going to have differences of opinion here and there, but that's one. And then the second thing I wrote down, then I think you have two that you're going to cite. It deepens our understanding of early church history. We talked a bit about this textual criticism. It gives us insights into how early Christians transmitted, they valued as well, they preserved scripture, and it connects back to the historical roots of our faith, whether it's, we're not talking first century, it may be second, third, fourth century transmission, second, sixth, and so forth. It's part of our Christian tradition and it roots us in that. I think you had a couple things you wrote down as well, Greg.
yeah, I would say one of the first things that I came across text criticism about is what text are we going to use to translate? Because in college and seminary, we had to translate. And so the more we know about the choices that are being made, then we know how we are going to translate this or which translations we're going to go with. There may be some that after a while, we begin to realize we just don't necessarily trust what these translators have done because they're not even using the text that I feel comfortable with. That's perhaps a bit of an extreme side of things, but it's a key role in establishing biblical translations.
Yeah.
But I think also on the other side, we have those people who would misrepresent the variations. And text criticism really helps to counter the claim that the Bible is fundamentally corrupted and that has changed substantially over time. Yes, there are a lot of variants because you have a lot of manuscripts, but the core of the text that is stable and unquestioned is remarkable given the ancient nature of the material that we're looking at.
The Scribal transmission process. I agree.
So I would say it really helps protect against that overreaction to say, well, why you do any of it because there's this one little change here. Well, no, that's not the way I would look at it. No. Much more confidence in it. So how would you use this in preaching? I know how I would use it in teaching. I just teach a text criticism class. Yeah. How would you do this?
That's a great question. I mean, you have to have intellectual honesty when you're communicating scripture and the text in the pulpit, maybe you're in the classroom, wherever it might be. And I think you have to acknowledge the significant variants when they're relevant, right? When you're preaching Mark, you talk about the short and the long ending of Mark and likely what transpired. And, when you look at that shorter ending, it actually brings, you and I have had a couple doctoral seminars on this, we've read Mark together. It brings it to life in a way, right? So yep. I think you need to not dwell on them. That can't be the main point of the sermon or the lesson that you're delivering for the most part, depends on the passage. But they need to be accounted for and you need to be transparent, when you're preaching and teaching those texts. So I think that's certainly one thing that our audience needs to account for. Right. You have another one here. I think we have four.
Yeah, I would agree with that. That it really helps build trust that you're not avoiding these questions, but you're demonstrating the remarkable preservation of the text and the rigor that lies behind the Bibles that we have. We can agree and disagree, and it's not going to make things crumble for us. I think it's a way of helping people in the church who don't do this all the time recognize that they can have confidence in it. And one of the things that I do is when I look at some of these variants in a sermon, which it sounds like a weird thing to do, but it does really come up handy at times, that it allows me to highlight the importance of the ongoing Christian community as I try to think through why would they have preserved this variant. And then getting into what churches, the life of the church, that it's not just the text, the sola scriptura, it's God moving in the Spirit in the life of the church. And that we keep coming back to these texts and we can see how God has worked in them. Whether we always agree with what we're seeing happen, we at least see that people are wrestling with what God is having them do in life.
That's in Scripture. Yeah, and that I mean, there's a degree. My third point here would be, we need to be intellectually honest with the people we're communicating with, right? So if you have a King James version and it's based on a very manuscript tradition that's late, longer readings, easier readings, and so forth, you're not being intellectually honest. You need to look at those early manuscripts because they're most likely representative of what that initial early text looked like. And you need to be honest with the people you're communicating with. And I think it builds, back to your point, it builds trust.
Yeah. Well, sometimes those difficult readings actually lead to breakthroughs in the interpretation of a whole passage.
Precisely. Gospel of Mark was one for me, right? That ending in 16:8 really is transformative in terms of how you view the wholeality of the Gospel of Mark when you read it.
Exactly. Well, we can look at specific passages, and we'll have more when we do something on Old Testament or Hebrew Bible textual criticism, because there's some wonderful passages there as well. But for now, if people want to look at this a little bit more in depth, please go check out our webpage at scripturalworks.com/articles, plural,
articles with an S.
Yes, plural, because we have multiple up there now. And so look for the very first one there, and you can read about a 40-minute read there.
It's called The Fascinating Journey of New Testament Textual Criticism, which walks you through a lot of the things that we talked about in this podcast. Has a bunch of footnotes, so if you're wanting resources to tap into additional reading, that's available. And then, Greg, we also have attached, I believe, to the podcast page, as well as that article, some resources. There's a plethora of stuff on textual criticism that people could look at, but there's 4 or 5 major texts. If you read all those, you're going to be a lot smarter than I am, which doesn't take a whole lot, but they're a good starting point anyway, right?
Exactly. It's always fun to get back into this.
And we usually publish in advance of the podcast because the articles are sort of companion pieces to the podcast. So there are a few advanced pieces there. I think there's 3 articles up on the site right now. So if you check those out, then you'll be able to get up to speed in terms of a few of the upcoming podcast shows. They also are deeper dives on, for example, the Western text of Acts is one, and there's another article that explores, biblical authority as part of the church community, which sort of is a piggyback on top of this textual text critical discussion that we just had today. You can check out our podcast on all the various channels as we referenced. If you want to view the video version, you can go to YouTube. This is the initial podcast, but there's a lot more forthcoming. The publication cycle will be about every 2 weeks. So you'll want to keep us tuned in, be subscribing on your podcast platform of choice. So, Greg, excited to be doing this with you and look forward to the next show.
This has been a dream come true. Retirement brings its benefits. So I hope you get to benefit even before you're retired. So it's wonderful that we've been able to pull this together.
Thanks, Greg. Thanks to our audience. We'll talk to you again soon.